So good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'm Rhoda Shermer, and welcome to the Network's March program with David K. Johnston. We're so thrilled we could get him here. Before we get going and rolling, because I know you're anxious to hear from him, I want to thank all of you for all your support, because I don't know how much you realize these programs depend on you. So thank you so much. And I especially want to thank three of our co-sponsors tonight: the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley, the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn, and Jolt of Ridgewood. Now, did any of you stop by the kids' table, the kids who are planning the march? That's great. We're so proud of them. One more thing, and then we'll get the program rolling, and that is I'd like you to know that our April 19th program is going to cover comprehensively the issues on immigration, and we have three extraordinary speakers for that program. So I hope to see every single one of you here on April 19th. You coming? Yes, okay. So thank you very much, and now let's get rolling with Peggy LaScala, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Welcome, everybody. I'd like to introduce our speaker, David K. Johnston. David is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and former president of Investigative Reporters and Editors. He teaches at Syracuse University College of Law, and he's familiar to many of you as a frequent guest on MSNBC, CNN, the BBC, and NPR, as well as other shows. And he's served as a consultant for the Netflix series House of Cards. Okay. David has lectured on economics, journalism, and tax policy on every continent except Antarctica. That's on his travel list, I'm sure, right now. Okay, he's the best-selling author of numerous books, including The Making of Donald Trump. He's here tonight. He'll be talking about his book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. Thank you. Welcome.
I'll also make sure I don't talk too long. Well, good evening. I'm glad that you're here, and I want to tell you that the most important thing to keep in mind is that we will get through this. However, it is not likely when we get to the point where we get through this to end well. On the other hand, as you will find, those of you who read this book, which is the sequel to my biography of Trump from 2 years ago, The Making of Donald Trump, Donald Trump is not the disease. He's the symptom. The disease is that we in America for decades now, and I would date this to the late 70s to early 80s, have been giving up democracy. In the 2016 election, close to 100 million people who were eligible to vote did not cast ballots. Young people, 18 to 21, whose parents and grandparents, like me, had sought the right to vote on the theory that, well, if you can draft us and kill us in Vietnam, we ought to have a right to vote, turned out in relatively low numbers. I suspect because of Parkland and the reaction of the students there, led by the students who take part in a national award-winning high school broadcast journalism program, that's about to change. But what we need to keep in mind is a simple, fundamental truth that we don't spend enough time thinking about and that we do not teach well in our schools, many of which no longer teach what those of us with gray hair remember to be in junior high school and high school civics. And that is the whole idea of the United States of America is that we choose our future. We've made a bad choice. We've made a terrible mistake. And it was a minority of us who made that mistake. What happened is that we've allowed our Constitution to atrophy in many areas. And one of them is the Electoral College, which is what put Donald Trump in the White House. Why do we have the Electoral College? Most people, when I ask them that, always say, well, so the small states have some influence. And that's true. But there was a second reason that the framers of our Constitution wrote about. They were very concerned about the mob, and they called the popular vote the mob. They had read their Athenian history. They had read their Roman history, and they were very worried about the mob. So they put in these checks and balances, one of which was designed that if it ended up that we had a zealot, someone who was manifestly unfit to be president, a crazy person, a criminal, that the Electoral College would step forward and say, no, we are not going to allow you to become president. Well, we got a crazy person who's a criminal, who's unfit to hold office, and only about 6 people in the Electoral College said no. The electors failed as the first check on the executive. Journalists failed too. The news coverage of this campaign was absolutely awful. And I don't just tell that to you. I was on a panel at City University of New York a couple of weeks after the votes in 2016, and one of the people on the panel was the political editor of the New York Times, where I worked for 13 years. And I started off my talk by saying I love the New York Times. I'm very glad that I worked at the New York Times. I'm very proud. There's no newspaper in the world as good as the New York Times, flaws and all. But the New York Times coverage of Donald Trump in this campaign was absolutely disastrous and indefensible. And I went through what voters weren't told. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand unless you learned what I asked you about from reading my book, okay? And then I'm going to have you keep your hand up. I want you to raise your hand if you know this, but keep your hand up. How many of you know that Donald Trump spent most of the 1980s deeply entangled with a major international cocaine trafficker he did favors for, whose case was moved from Ohio to the New Jersey courtroom of Judge Marianne Trump Berry? How many knew that from my books or seeing me? Almost nobody knows that. You are better informed, I assure you, than the average audience in America. People don't know this. They're not aware of it. And I've said publicly repeatedly when I say what Donald Trump did with Joseph Wexelbaum, a twice convicted felon after the DEA caught him, a 3-time convicted felon, makes no sense whatsoever unless Donald Trump was in business with Joe Wexelbaum in drug trafficking, whereupon everything he did makes absolutely perfect sense. And it falls into the school of, Joe, I'll never rat you out, don't worry. Just stick to your confession. Don't get me involved in this. I'll never rat you out. And I've said, you know, if Donald Trump thinks that that's not true, I invite him to sue me. That's how firmly I think the evidence shows his conduct. Sue me. He certainly has a lot more resources than I do. Now, what's important now that Donald Trump is the President of the United States is frankly not the crazy tweets, the racist comments, the nuttiness going on in the White House, the chaos. What matters is what is not in the news and what I wrote this book to address. Team Trump has put into our government what I call political termites. And I call them political termites because, like wood termites, you don't see them eating away at the structure of your house until one morning you walk into the kitchen and boom, your foot goes through the floor. And you've got a huge bill to repair and fix the damage. Now, Donald didn't do this personally. Donald is lazy. The White House hasn't even disputed reports that he comes to work around 11:30 and leaves around 4, and that includes lunch. He wants to get back to watching himself on Fox. But the people whose names you haven't heard, and in many cases you're not likely to hear, are the people that are doing the damage to our government, who are eating away at our substance. People have been put into these departments with the express purpose of weakening and if they can, destroying our government. At the Environmental Protection Agency, this is perhaps better known than other places, but in my book I tell the story of a senior EPA executive, someone you and I have invested a fortune in developing knowledge and skills and talents in a very sophisticated person. And when Scott Pruitt, the former Attorney General from fossil fuels, arrived as EPA director, he did a whole bunch of interesting things we've never seen before. First of all, they put locks on the outer doors of the EPA administrator's office. Secondly, if you were called or summoned to any of the executive offices, you were stopped by a security guard. You had to leave your cell phone or anything else that might be capable of recording a conversation, and you were then brought into the offices. All conversations were one-sided conversations. The woman whom I quote at length in the book had worked under 11 EPA administrators, and she said every single one of them, they would come by her office, or they would ring her up and say, hey, can you come to my office? I got a problem. And they would discuss, well, this industry or this company or this senator has some complaint, and how do we deal with this, and what do we do? And sometimes, you know, Betsy was happy with the outcome, and sometimes she wasn't, but it was all based on the political realities of dealing with powerful people and what the law says. Not Scott Pruitt. He told her and her staff of people that you are to write highly detailed reports on every weakness in the Clean Water Act. If we bring any kind of case under the Clean Water Act, I want to know every single weakness. Now think about that for a minute. Who do you think is going to benefit from that? Do you think that it led to Scott Pruitt going to Congress and saying, you know, we need to shore up the Clean Water Act that Richard Nixon signed in 1971? No, this was written to be a guide to polluters on how to defeat enforcement of the laws even after this administration is gone. And the people at EPA, being good bureaucrats, did what they were told. They wrote these reports. They were summoned to a meeting. They were asked only very technical questions. What does that word mean? Or why is that word there rather than somewhere else? There was no feedback. And then all the paperwork, all the documentation was taken from them. They were told to eliminate everything that they had, and they were dismissed. These are not people fulfilling their oaths. These are people who are setting out to destroy our government. I want you to notice I always talk about our government. One of the worst things the news media does is refer to the government. Now, if you're the BBC, I expect you to refer to the US government as the government. But in America, I think we need to start talking in our personal conversations and our communications with others about our government. We own it. We need to act like owners. If we do that, we will take a much deeper interest in the policies of our government. One of the principal ideas of this government is compromise. Democracy is based on the notion of compromise. Now at Syracuse, where I'm not teaching this year, but I did for 8 years, I taught the law of the ancient world. One course was the property and tax law of the ancient world. The other was the business regulatory law of the ancient world. There's an enormous amount of business regulation in Hammurabi's Code, in the Old Testament, in Athenian law, in Roman law, in Egyptian law, Chinese law, Indian law that I would teach my students because I was really teaching them, why is the law the way it is today? How did we get here? And is it arbitrary or is it based on human experience? Well, those laws, in many ways, are flawed, and I show flaws in them of all sorts of kinds, things that maybe at the time were not thought at all to be flaws, but we see today that they are as we learn new things and we acquire new things. And in the regulatory course, I would have my students 3 times spend their 3 hours together designing a regulatory system. The first time we would do one about steamboats, because after the first steamboat was crossing the Hudson River over here, other manufacturers got into it. Some of them weren't so good, and there were about 7,000 people who were scalded alive in various places across this country when badly made steam engines exploded. Well, how are we going to solve this problem? And I take the 20 or so students I have, and you're the guy who's selling it, you're the insurer, you're the banker, you're somebody standing on the dock to wave goodbye to your family because they're going to visit someone. All these different roles. And what the students the first time do is they realize they have no idea what they're doing. And then we do it a second time for the 1905 New York City dynamite law. You can't have construction in Manhattan, which is a big rock, without dynamite. They get better at it. And then we do it a third time, usually with securities laws. And by the third one, everybody has this deep appreciation that everybody else in the room has a legitimate interest and they're not the same. And you have to make compromises if you're going to have a successful regime where we can all live and get along together. That's not what's going on in this administration. This administration is the embodiment of the my way or the highway argument. And it is based largely on the whims of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who I've known for 30 years, is not a man with any philosophy at all, except I am the greatest. And this is a guy who makes Muhammad Ali, the boxer, look modest. This is a man who doesn't literally know anything. He said he's going to make Mexico pay for a wall. And he repeatedly was asked, how are you going to make Mexico pay for the wall? It's a sovereign country. I have a plan. As soon as I get in office, I'm not going to give it away. So he gets in office, and what's his plan? He's going to put a tariff on Mexican goods, which means you and I pay for the wall through higher prices, not just on Mexican goods, but if it's a 20% tariff, we're going to pay 19% higher prices on American-made goods because American companies can raise their prices just below the tariff level and expand their market share. Donald doesn't know this because he doesn't know what he's doing. Donald, I quote word for word from the book, him's arguing that he is the world's greatest expert of all time on taxes. Nobody knows more than Donald about taxes. Now, my next book is an entirely new tax system for the United States for the 21st century economy. It's a project I've spent more than a decade refining and developing and working out until now the experts in the field I take it to can't poke any holes in it. But Donald, under oath, has testified when he's asked, well, so what do you know about accounting? I don't know anything about accounting. Leave that to the accountants. Well, to claim you're an expert on taxes and then say you know nothing about taxes would be the equivalent of my standing up here and saying, you probably don't know that I am the world's greatest expert in all time on the design of airplanes. I am the greatest airplane designer ever born. What's a wing? That's how silly it is. And yet millions and millions of people believe Donald Trump is their savior. And they believe anybody who's opposed to him must be a horrible person. I get astonishing emails from people about why do I love Sharia law? I've looked all over. I had my research assistant do all sorts of looking through Nexus. I said, please find me some American politician. I don't care if it's the city council person in you never heard of it, middle of Texas, who supports Sharia law, wants to go to Sharia, can't find them. It's not really a unicorn. It's more of a chimera. Well, we have to get along with this guy, like it or not. He's got his finger on the button. At the moment, he has a Secretary of Defense who I think it's become pretty clear by his actions is not going to let him use the button. An illegal order to use it is not going to happen. And by the way, just think for a moment about what would happen if Trump went through with his casual talk about killing everybody in North Korea. 25 million people, half the population of South Korea. People who are so poor, if you look at satellite images at night, all of Asia along the coast is lit up, and there's this black hole. It's North Korea. The average annual income in North Korea is the equivalent of about 10 days' income here in North Jersey. That's how little people get by on. There's widespread malnutrition. There's the use of forced slave labor in fishing and mining in Russia and China. to bring foreign currency back to this failed state that's a cult, where you must express your personal loyalty to the leader, or terrible things will happen to you. Where people who've escaped say that they were told that they were the wealthiest people in the world. And then they get to Seoul and they discover things like ice cream and big signs on the side of buildings. They can't believe it. If we were to do what Donald Trump casually said, just nuke off the face of the earth North Korea, we would become a pariah nation. Everybody would stop doing business with us. You know, you want to go on a vacation to Europe? I'm sorry, we don't allow Americans. We don't accept your passport. Or you'll have to go through a rigorous vetting process and get permission to come. What happened to the apartheid regime in South Africa that finally brought it to its knees under de Klerk? That would be a picnic compared to what would happen to us. Now, in the fall, I traveled around the world. I literally flew 51,000 actual air miles, lectured on 5 continents on 5 Fridays. And I was astonished everywhere I went about how uniform the reaction was to Donald Trump. And the basic reaction to people, from high government officials that I met, journalists I met, academics, business leaders, down to chambermaids who I engaged in conversation, who were making up my room, was, what happened to your country? How could this happen? How could this crazy person be the president of the United States? What is wrong with you people? And they were all scared. They were all literally scared. Now, one of the things that Donald Trump promised is that he was the champion of the forgotten man. If you remember his inaugural address, the forgotten man will be forgotten no more. It took him about 5 minutes after he left the Capitol to forget the forgotten man. And in this book and in the news service that I run with my friends, it's a nonprofit, mostly volunteer project with a huge budget of about $6,000 a month, where we break story after story after story that sometimes we get the major news organizations to follow us, almost never with credit, is that he's actively going after the common man. It isn't just his, I'm going to drain the swamp, and then he stocks it with swamp monsters from Goldman Sachs. It's other things this government is doing. The first budget that Trump put forward proposed that for seniors who are between 60 and 90% disabled, veterans who are between 60 and 90% disabled, and who get treated as if they're fully disabled, because basically employers don't want to hire you at that rate. And I know this because my father, I watched him after World War II go through progression until he became 100% disabled. And once he was at about 40%, nobody wants to hire you. He got hired because he was a very talented chef, but 65% or so, he couldn't work anymore. Well, Donald Trump's first budget proposed that when you reach early retirement age for Social Security, 62, that your annual income, which currently is about $35,000, be cut to $13,000. Literally plunging you into poverty. Nobody's going to take care of the veterans the way I will. Nobody. I'm going to take care of our veterans. Nobody's been taking care of them. Both parties. I'm going to take care of our veterans. Really? You're going to plunge them into poverty. Now, that's not going to happen. They've dropped that because Congress said, we're not doing that. The most troglodyte members of Congress said, we're not doing that. But it's indicative of his attitude. He also proposed, by the way, and they're still working on this one in various ways, to round down all checks. So if your benefit is $3,000.99 a month, you lose the 99 cents. Now, it's not a lot of money. We're talking about a few $1 million in a $20 trillion economy, but the symbolism of it is overwhelming. Look at the Second Amendment. Donald Trump used to be against the kinds of weapons that are used to massacre our children. And let's not beat around the bush about it. That's what they're being used for, to massacre our children. And it is shocking to me that everybody isn't out in the streets demanding an end to this. Not just young people, who are going to find out, by the way, it's going to take you a long time to get this changed. Change does not come easily. Our government was designed to be resistant to change. The people who got these changes, they worked on it for decades. This shouldn't take decades, but it's not going to happen overnight either. Donald Trump, in every case that we have looked at dcreport.org, singular, dcreport.org, singular, his actions are inimical to the interests of ordinary Americans, inimical to the interests of the people he promised to champion. Now, where did Donald Trump get this idea that we need to drain the swamp and that Washington is taking care of itself and the political donor class at the expense of the vast majority of Americans? I know exactly where Donald got it. He got it from me. I've known Donald for 30 years. He and I have talked about these issues. I asked him one time, what do you think about health care as a business owner? And he said, health care should be just like the roads. When you need one, you just use it. You don't pay anything, you just go use it. Think about that in contrast to what he's proposing now to take away health care from 31 million people and enhance the power of the insurance companies. There's no moral principle here that applies to him. It's whatever is convenient in the moment. Donald very brilliantly took the message in my best-selling trilogy of books, which I know he watched me on television talk about for the 10-year period it took to write all three of them. Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and The Fine Print. And he talked to other people who, told me about these conversations where he was testing out these ideas that he was intrigued with about what I argued was, being not a marketing person like Donald, upward redistribution, stealth siphoning of money out of your pocket, and other terms like that. And Donald brilliantly distilled that into drain the swamp. Washington doesn't care about you. They're taking care of themselves and their friends. And it was a brilliant message. And in fact, in 2012, I said on one of the national TV shows that I was on, anybody who runs for president on my three books is going to get elected because of the numbers. The bottom 90% of Americans that year had smaller incomes than in 1967. People in the year 2012 in the bottom 90% worked all year to get 51 and a half weeks of the income that they had in 1967 when you adjust for inflation. And on top of that, the number of them who had pensions went way down. Way down. The number of them who had fully paid health care the way I did when I was a young man, when I was a 23-year-old home-owning journalist with 5 children, and my medical bills amounted to $1 every time one of the kids needed to see a doctor, which would be about $7 today. That's all gone. We have in this country been steadily reducing what economists call returns to labor and increasing returns to capital. When the economy grows, there's only 2 places the money can go. It either goes to capital or it goes to labor. Now, you want to have good, solid returns to labor because it's to capital, because it's growing capital and the productive investment of capital that leads to jobs that allows us to finance economic activity. But what we've been doing is 2 things in the last 40 years. We've been reducing the returns to labor. We've been pushing down wages for everybody below the CEO class. In fact, that's the only job in America where we strive to pay you the highest possible paycheck, because it's a rigged system in which other CEOs sit on the board, and many companies have policies that say it's the policy of our company to pay our senior executives in the top quartile, which of course means you have to keep pushing up to try to get into the top quartile. And at the same time, while getting rid of unions, only about 6% of private sector workers now are in unions, and the Trump administration is determined to completely destroy unions. So people have no bargaining power. And if you were to say to Donald Trump, Pope Francis says without unions there's no economic justice, he would say, well, he's wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about. On the other side, we are increasingly rewarding capital for investing in unproductive assets. A hedge fund is not a productive asset. A hedge fund is making money off of money, something the ancient Greeks thought was immoral, something that the Old Testament made a crime. You can't make money off money. You're going to make money, you can make money by planting a tree and getting the fruit from the tree, but you're not supposed to make money off money, especially within your own group. Maybe you can charge interest to people outside the group under certain circumstances. And you had to have provisions to help the poor. If the only thing a poor person had as security for their debt was their cloak that they slept under at night, even if they still owed you money, at the end of the day, you had to give it back to them so they wouldn't freeze to death. Who does Donald Trump nominate for a Supreme Court position that should have gone to Barack Obama? Judge Gorsuch, who in a dissent as a member of the Court of Appeals in one of the Midwestern districts said that a truck driver who had to choose between freezing to death or violating his company's policies for which they could fire him was properly fired. In other words, in my view, he said that you should die rather than lose your job or lose your job. This is the kind of absolutely immoral people who are attracted to Donald Trump and who he is attracted to in return. And the policies that they are working to put in place are doing exactly this. Now, on Sunday, there'll be a full-page review of my book in the New York Times. It's not as hostile as the one from my book, Free Lunch 10 years ago, in which the writer, A, never told anybody what was in the book, and B, essentially described me as being part of a Democratic Party internecine battle. It's a strange thing to accuse a reporter of, so I went to the executive editor's office and said, if you guys think this, you should fire me right now. Shouldn't even let me resign. You should just fire me. And I said, oh, by the way, I'm a registered Republican. But one of the arguments made by the guy reviewing my book is that, well, Donald really hasn't done much to weaken our government. Well, that's a perfectly good issue to debate. How much has he weakened our government? Look around and ask yourself, what do you think? If tomorrow you discover that one of the many chemical companies here in North Jersey has decided to go back to just dumping stuff in a drain, what do you think the odds are that the Justice Department under Jeff Sessions and the EPA under Pruitt are going to immediately act against that company? You going to call them or are you going to call the governor's office? That would be the question to ask yourself. If you discover that you've been had through some financial product, are you going to get the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, the great accomplishment of Elizabeth Warren beyond her study that changed what we understood about who files bankruptcy? By the way, everybody files bankruptcy roughly in proportion to their share of the population, whether you're a dentist or a banker or a hod carrier. It's part of the human condition. It's not a part of your social status. Are they going to help you? No. They're making sure that that agency is totally ineffective. An agency that, by the way, has won back for consumers about 4 times what we've spent on it. How about job exports? If you work in a job exporting business, but you're a small company or you're in a small factory, maybe you work in a place where there's 75 or 100 people in the factory. It's not General Electric or Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. It's the kind of business that we are always talking about is so wonderful, the mom and pop business, the kind of corporation that my oldest son and I started here in New Jersey, and he still runs successfully. Well, we have a federal agency to help little exporters. If you're General Electric or Boeing, the biggest exporter we have, you have a whole staff of people who scour the world selling your products. But what if you're doing $10 million a year in sales? You can't have offices all over the world. You probably can't afford to have one. So our federal government has a program. It's absolutely a subsidy program to help these small exporters of manufactured goods get their products out there, to work through the red tape of other countries, and to be successful in promoting sales. The way that we historically have measured this agency, for every dollar of subsidy we put into it as taxpayers, these outfits sell $850 worth of goods overseas. So if you assume the profit margin they have is 10%, which is a reasonable number for a manufacturer, that means that we get we get $85 of profit for every dollar we spend. Trump wants to get rid of it, or at least the team he brought in, the political termites who are there to destroy the government, they want to get rid of it. Who benefits from doing that? Well, not the forgotten man who works in the small manufacturing company, but it might help big companies that are less efficient or that don't want to face competition. And the less competition, of course, the higher prices are, the less efficient the economy is, and the fewer benefits you get from market capitalism, which is all based on competition. Now, we aren't going to see anything change with the current Congress. From now till next January 3rd, barring something absolutely unexpected, Donald Trump suddenly starts tearing his clothes off and screaming the Martians are coming. I mean, it would have to be that crazy. Nothing's going to change. The leaders in Congress, Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, have made it perfectly clear that they are not even protecting the perquisites and the institutional interests of the House and the Senate, because they have decided they're better off with Donald Trump than any other option open to them. The most important election in this country since the Civil War, and I include 1932, when this country could have become a fascist country, it could have become a communist country, it could have fallen into uncontrolled violence. The most important election in this country since the Civil War is this fall. And I say that because if we don't get a new Congress, if you're a Republican, if you don't follow the advice of Max Boot, a prominent conservative thinker and writer, that it is the duty of every Republican to vote out the Republican members of the House and Senate unless they've stood up to Donald Trump, I have a pretty good idea of where I think things are going to go. And let me just tell you, I have a track record of going to editors and proposing things and writing about things that turn out years later to be correct. I left the LA Times and went to the Philadelphia Inquirer because I said casinos are going to spread all across America, and I had structural reasons it was going to happen. And the editors of the LA Times said, that's crazy, you can't predict what's going to happen in 25 years. I even picked the states the casinos spread to in 1992, named them, and got almost every one of them right. I believe that if we maintain the current Congress we have, here's what's going to happen. Somebody will come along running for president who does not have Donald Trump's deficits. That is somebody who's actually smart, somebody who is highly educated, somebody who has real management skills, someone who knows how to build wealth in their business rather than doing what Donald does, which is extract cash as fast as he can and not pay people and then move on to the next mark, because that's what con artists do. Somebody who has the same charisma that Donald Trump has. They're going to come along and they're going to be in the White House. And then we're really going to be in deep trouble. It will be the end of our individual liberties. It will be the rise of an authoritarian state of the kind that Donald Trump clearly wants. Look at who he praises. When Erdogan wins his rigged election in Turkey that puts him this far from being a dictator, this far from turning a country that has been secular since Ataturk came to power in 1905 and turning it into an Islamic state. One Western leader called to praise him, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, when he ran for office, constantly attacked what I call the 9 thugs who run China, a communist dictatorship with Chinese characteristics of capitalism, a place where they shoot people, they beat people to death if they don't follow the party line. You try to organize a union not approved by the government in China, the local police will kill you, and there'll be no retribution or punishment for them. They'll do it with impunity. As soon as Donald Trump gets in office and he gets all these additional intellectual property rights and his daughter Ivanka gets them in time like this, just incredible how quickly they were approved. Mere coincidence, the Chinese government says. Suddenly, President Xi is this great guy. And who does Donald Trump constantly talk about as a model? Vladimir Putin, a man who poisons people, a man who had his most prominent political opponent not just shot to death, and not just shot to death on the streets, but shot to death at a point where the cameras of both the official Russian news agencies, which is to say their propaganda agencies, and the West, would shoot pictures of the dead body, and the background would be the Kremlin so that no one missed getting the message. You mess with Vladimir Putin, he'll kill you. These are the people Donald Trump admires because he's an authoritarian. Donald believes you are supposed to be loyal to him, as he tried to get James Comey to do. He believes you exist to help him. And by the way, Donald believes, and he's not corrupt about this, he believes that of course he should be president of the United States. He should run the whole world. He is genetically superior to you and me. He's smarter than us. He has the world's greatest memory. He intuitively knows things so well that in 90 minutes he can learn everything you need to know about nuclear-tipped missiles. 90 minutes. Ask Barack Obama, who wrote his senior thesis on that subject, how long it took him. And he doesn't pretend to be an expert on that subject. If we don't get a new Congress, and I don't mean a new Congress with a margin of a few votes, I mean a new Congress. If we don't get a Senate that won't convict when provided with evidence of corruption and, more importantly, disloyalty by Donald Trump, we're going to see the end, within the lifetime of the young people sitting in this room, of the America we know. We created this country to ennoble the human spirit, to see what people could achieve. We created this country at great risk. All of the most wealthy and successful people in this country, except in Philadelphia, would have been hung had they not been successful in the guerrilla attack on the British. And thank God the British were busy pursuing other things, so we got their fifth-rate General Cornwallis and we could beat them. We founded this country so that we wouldn't have a state religion, so that we wouldn't have a king telling us what to do, so that we could choose our destiny. There are a lot of people who really don't like that. They would rather have a government that tells you what to do. So this election, people need to be, first and foremost, they need to vote. All the rest of this, the TV shows that I and other people appear on, the debates in Congress, they don't matter. Not compared to who votes. People need to register to vote. There's 100 million people out there in round numbers who we need to not only get registered if they're not, but get them to the polls. If you live in a district where you're totally happy with your member of Congress, and be very cautious about that, even if you're a Dem and the person is a Dem. You know, there's lots of research that people say, I hate Congress, but I love my congressperson. Well, that's not, no. You got to look cold-bloodedly at your existing congressperson and whether they need to go. And when election time comes, in advance, you need to call up people in districts where getting a turnout matters. Gerrymandering can be defeated. The math of gerrymandering is you create districts that favor your party by 54, 55 at the most percent. 53 is the number you target for, but 53 or 54. Turn out the vote, you can defeat that. Then it means you have to organize in advance and call people and get in a car, and you have to have 2 people in a car and go drive people to the polls. Because at the end of the day in a democracy, the thing that matters is who votes and who they vote for. Now, if Donald Trump is impeached and removed from office, you know what he will do, because he's already done it. He will spend the rest of his days going around the country fomenting violence against the United States of America, because during the campaign, when he was seeking votes, hey, I want you to vote for me, what would he do? Beat that person up. Get that thug out of here. Go ahead, I'll pay your legal bills if you beat him up. Imagine if he's out of office and humiliated, what he would do. If he is voted out of office in the primaries, and there are going to be primary challenges to him in 2020 if he's still in office, or he's voted out of office in the general election, we already know what he's going to do. It was rigged. I really won the vote. It's all those illegals who voted, the people that, that voted for Hillary. It was totally corrupt. It was illegal. The Russians helped the other party or the primary challenger. So if Donald Trump is not impeached, convicted, which takes 67 votes, and then prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison, we will, for the rest of his life, face violence in the streets over this. I don't mean full-scale riots, but there will be trouble. The Comet Pizza Shop case, Hillary Clinton's supposed pedophile ring in the pizza store in D.C., is not going to be an anomaly anymore. But we need to do whatever it takes to get this unqualified, crazy, at times delusional, and totally self-centered man out of our White House, and we need to take back our government. Thank you. So I'm going to take questions from people, and the only thing I ask you to do is ask a question, because there are other people going to want to ask questions. If you give a speech, I'll cut you off, and I'll say, figure out the question, I'll come back to you. But who has questions? Sir, you first, then you.
I think that there was a reason why Donald Trump was elected. And it was that there was a great dissatisfaction for the condition of the United States,
Yes,
at least in a certain
I agree. So
area.
what's the question?
The question is, if we concentrate only on how bad Donald Trump is, and we don't concentrate on resolving the problem that elected him, do we run the risk of having Donald Trump on 2020?
I love that question. If you can pass the microphone down to the lady down here. As I said during my talk, the 90% of Americans in 2012 had less income than in 67, and their income's just barely gone up from them, and when you look at their total circumstances, they're worse. 50% of Americans today live in economic terror. We're in a prosperous area right here. Get in a plane, fly to Nebraska, and drive across the state. Stop in every town of any size and get a hotel room, and you will be shocked at how awful it is. You may even be scared if you go to a coffee shop in the middle of the night at how many people around you are tweaking on meth. And yes, we have to get going. If Donald Trump had come into office and the first thing he had done was an infrastructure program, the Democrats, would have had to go with him, and it would have created an enormous amount of jobs. I was on a radio show, 10 years ago with a congressman. I didn't even know who he was. I didn't even know I was going to be on with him. And the congressman was asked, I was talking about infrastructure, and particularly roads, and he said, we can't afford to fix up our roads. There's no money. And I said, really? Well, Congressman, how do you expect the grapefruit growers in Texas and the tomato growers in Texas and the dairy companies in Wisconsin to get their products to market if we don't fix up our roads? That's ridiculous. We have to fix and maintain our infrastructure. And I said, you go to China, the roads in China are unbelievable. Their highways, they put the Autobahn to shame, which puts our interstates to shame. Yeah, we have to have a whole lot of reforms. We have to get and make it possible for people to organize so they can negotiate for their wages and their benefits. When 37% of private sector workers belonged to unions, which was the case in 1973, 80% of workers benefited. We have to go back to making college what it was when I went to college, free or virtually free. It shouldn't be a loan program. And the reward we get for that as a society for investing in young minds is they make more wages and we tax them in the future. We have to do a whole lot of things that need change. That's why we need a whole new Congress. And the conditions that got Donald Trump elected are not going to change without major changes in who we put in office. Absolutely. And that includes lots of Democrats.
Do you see anyone addressing this problem now?
I see people who talk about this problem. Bernie Sanders talks about this problem. The problem is that he's terrible to his staff, and he's never accomplished anything in Congress. What the Democrats need, I believe, is they need somebody who's in their 40s or 50s, probably had military service, is well educated, and because it's the TV age, you know, at least half decent looking. And my guess is at this moment, the most likely next president of the United States is the junior senator from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand. So, I'm not arguing that I want her necessarily. I'm just telling you I look at what's going on. And politics is not my field, so I could be completely wrong. I'm a policy guy. Ma'am.
Well, that really was my question, was who do you think is a viable candidate to defeat Donald Trump? Unfortunately, based on the current atmosphere in this country, I'm not sure that a Christian Gillibrand can be elected.
Well, maybe and maybe not. I mean, there certainly is. We know that sexism is a very, very deep, misogyny is very deeply rooted. So is racism in our society. But somebody who comes into office saying, "Look, I want us to rebuild the country," okay? Somebody who can articulate things like on tax policy. How many of you read or have heard that Apple is about to pay the government or has paid $38 billion over profits it kept overseas? It's not true. No. At DC Report, we revealed the truth, after which other places wrote sort of, you know, stories, but they wouldn't credit us. And we wrote to them and said, you know, we did this first, you should credit us. Well, nobody's ever heard of you, so we're not going to credit you. What Apple got was an 8-year zero-interest loan of $35 billion of the $38 billion. A zero-interest loan. Plus, in Apple's case, they got a 57% discount on the taxes. They really should have paid more than $80 billion. And some companies got a 70% discount on their taxes in this bill. Can you imagine how well off you would be if Congress said, hey, listen, we're going to loan you 92% of your income taxes this year for the next 8 years, and by the way, we're going to backload it. You're going to pay most of it in 2025, and 2024 and 2025. And we're going to cut the taxes you actually pay us by either 57 or 70%. Well, you didn't get that deal, but Apple and GE and Nike, they all got that deal. And, you know, the news media just failed to report it. But look, leaders arise when there's a need for them. And we're going to see people arise. And once we get new leadership, one of the biggest things we have to push for beyond going back to understanding that the Second Amendment has 27 words, the first 13 of which are about a militia and are about arms. They're not about guns. They're about arms. If you're going to be a Second Amendment literalist, I always say, well, it's about arms, not guns, so I want a personal nuclear weapon because nobody's going to mess with me. And we need somebody who can articulate and talk to people who are not part of the college-educated crowd, who are not the people who are in this room tonight, you know, and whose aspirations are not to own their own jet. You know, but hopefully someone like that will arise, and they're not going to come from the authoritarian right. So who's next? Well, how about one here and one up there? Go ahead, you sir, you first.
How are you going to educate that 100 million people who are not voting now to the issues and the importance of those?
Well, I'm not going to educate those 100 million people, okay? The way we educate those people is the way change in America always happens. I mean, think about the history of our country, okay? Once we got it founded. This country was founded on an evil premise involving the ownership of human beings. We got rid of it. It cost the equivalent of 6 million of today's Americans dying as a share of the population, and about 400,000 of those were black Americans, but we got rid of slavery. It took Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton their entire lives to get men to vote the right to vote for women. But they did. We got child labor laws when the Jerry Falwells and Pat Robertsons of the day were going around the country saying, it is God's plan that these children work in the factories. And those of you who are in favor of these child labor laws, you are the agents of the devil. Things don't change about human beings, okay? You know, go to Pompeii and Herculaneum and walk around and you'll realize it's a shopping mall just like we have today. And built on the scale of a shopping mall because they didn't have electricity or gasoline engines. And so ordinary people are going to have to take responsibility. That's how democracy works. And if you don't take responsibility, well, then, you're going to live with what you get.
But you have young people today who can recite every word of a Beyonce song or Jay.
That's always been true.
But they have no idea who their congressman is, who the vice president is. who the Speaker of the House is.
That's always been true.
But how do you get
Always
those
been true.
people then
Because
to
you,
realize?
well, first of all, I'm in the diagnosis business, not the curing business. That's a higher job category. But fundamentally, it means that those people who do know how to do that need to get out, and they need to work on the marketing and the organizing. There's a group called Indivisible. They have apparently created somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 groups with virtually no funding. And one of the most brilliant things Indivisible has done, they go to the office of Chris Collins, I live in Rochester, New York. He's a congressman from Buffalo. And they go to his offices where he will not show up anymore. And they don't, chant angrily like students did in the 60s. They have cupcakes and they sing songs and they make fun of him. And humor, can do a lot. But, yes, people are going to have to put time and effort into this and get organized. It's not easy. It's not easy. I'm not going to tell you it's easy. If you want to outsource it, that's easy, and you look what you get. So, ma'am, up here, Cindy.
Yeah, hi. Do you have advice for the Democratic Party on how we can overcome the divisions within the party that were really exacerbated during the 2016 presidential election? I think.
Well, in addition to my book, I would encourage you, and both my Trump books, because the first one is about his whole criminal history and involvement, all from the public record. I would encourage you to read Hacks, Donna Brazil's book, which was written by a journalist I trained named Donnell Morton. Because Hacks is about hubris in the Hillary Clinton camp and the refusal to listen to advice. And while it's an old saw in politics that once you have a campaign strategy, you shouldn't deviate from it, her campaign was based on a Maginot Line. If the tanks ran around the line, you need to rethink your campaign. And she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't listen. She, in fact, went out of her way to humiliate the DNC staff. Or at least the people around her did. Maybe it was with Trump. It was Team Hillary that did this. I think the Democrats have some real problems. I said to Nancy Pelosi to her face that there's a disconnect when I see the leader of the party of working people wearing a $4,000 sheath dress, to show off a figure that at 78 most 20-year-old women would kill for, right? And Christian Louboutin high heels with the red soles, and working people. And when we were both in San Francisco back in April of last year, Nancy pointed out to me she was wearing dungarees. And I said, yes, tailored dungarees. I mean, there really is a disconnect here, and this is not in any way to be critical of wealth, okay? I want people who care about acquiring wealth to do so. I want people to be successful. If it's not important to you, then that's fine, but if it is important to you, I want you to acquire wealth. And the wealthier you get, I want you to also recognize that your duty to people less fortunate grows in geometric proportion to your wealth, because there's less and less utility to you from it. But here's a woman she and her husband have been very, very successful, and she's worth, at the lowest number, 70 million and probably well over 100 million. This is the leader of the Working People's Party. And she's a brilliant strategist as Speaker in the House. But is that who the party needs to get people across the country to be interested in what the party's going to do? My brother is a manual laborer. He's the guy who in the storm was getting the tree trunk out of the culvert so the water would flow and you could go to work and make a living. You've all seen these guys, okay? They all end up like my brother. My brother is in his early 60s, or I guess he's 65 now. He's like this if he tries to walk, because he's all busted up from so many accidents. Close to getting killed a few times from doing this work, which doesn't pay very well. And I asked him one time, he lives in what we politely call a manufactured home in rural Oregon in the forest, why all the people around him had signs for McCain. And my brother said, well, if I believed in God, if I hated gays or I loved guns, I'd vote for the Republicans too, because what the blank have the Democrats done for me? Tell me what they've done for me. I've seen them cut and cut and cut. Widows' benefits, Social Security, health care, the quality of the roads I'm driving on. You tell me why I should vote for the Democrats. What have they ever done for me? And frankly, I said, you know, you got a point. And it's part of the reason that I often refer to the Democratic establishment as, in the name of that awful product no one should ever buy, LITE beer, that the Democrats have become Republican light. And when I've talked to Democrats about this, and I've interviewed over 100 senators and congressmen, none of them in the past 10 years, but in the 90s and the early 2000s, about the campaign finance system, they all hate it. They find it humiliating. I mean, Bob Dole, you know, told me about, you know, this is just awful. But they're all risk averse, what economists call risk averse. They don't want to have, they know the system they have and they're terrified of a system they don't have. So they don't do anything. Well, the answer to that is, fine, throw them all out and get new people. And it won't be perfect with new people. They don't have experience and they may, you know, go off the deep rail. It's a risky proposition. That's why they're risk averse. So it's up here, way up, young person, oh, is it you they're pointing to? All right, in the brick color. Okay, oh, there's a microphone.
You mentioned that the New York Times did a terrible job, and you gave an example.
Everybody did, but I was picking on the Times that time.
What did the New York Times do wrong besides that one story that you said?
Oh, here's basic. I can tell you very simply what the New York Times did wrong. In the news business, we do something called a scrub of a candidate. So when Barack Obama ran for president, you will hear people, if you watch Fox News, you know, they'll tell you that nobody told the truth about Barack Obama. You know, he's born in Kenya, and he's part of the Mau Mau's and all sorts of crazy things. You go to the clips of the New York Times, you will see the New York Times interviewed his playmates in Indonesia in kindergarten. Kids he smoked dope with in high school. I'm shocked. High schoolers smoking dope. As the father of 8, I'm especially shocked. George W. Bush, his history as a failed tax shelter salesman. That's what you do when you're selling oil and gas leases, you're selling tax leases, tax shelters. The fact that he owed most of his fortune to a tax subsidy, but he hired Democrats to get it passed. This was the subsidy for the baseball team. All this stuff was written about. Bill Clinton getting his wife taking $2 for every pair of used underwear they donated to the Goodwill. Go look at the clips of the New York Times. Donald Trump wasn't scrubbed. I actually called one of my former editors who was still at the paper in the fall of 16, and I said I had written this article July the year before, 21 questions for Donald Trump that journalists should ask. No journalist asked any of the questions. Ted Cruz asked one, and Marco Rubio asked one. And I said, why aren't you guys answering these questions? He said, well, if you had to do one, what would it be? And I said, Joe Exelbaum, the drug trafficker. And he goes, when was this? The 80s. Oh, my God, that is so long ago. And I said, wait a minute, we're talking about presidents of the United States. We dig into their lives from the moment they were born. No, we're not. It's too old. We're not going to. There was no formal finding that he was in business with him. I said, you don't need to make a formal finding. Just report what he did. No, it's too old. The 80s is too old. Guess what that Sunday's front page New York Times lead story was? And the front page of the Sunday New York Times, that's the best journalism real estate on the entire planet. And 2 or 4, I think it was 4, but at least 2 clean inside pages, no ads. What Hillary Clinton was doing in Arkansas in the 1970s. During the period from June 16th, 2015, when Donald Trump came down the escalator with Melania, to November 8th, when the voting took place, the New York Times had in an article exactly 4 articles that had the word Trump and mafia. And they were all in passing. A typical one was the columnist, and I know I mispronounced his last name, Ross Douthat, who said, and then there's questions about Trump and the mafia. Well, what about the Russian mafia? What about all the violent felons he's done business with? What about all his lying under oath? What about his hiding records from auditors? None of that was reported. And I think I know why. Why? Because Donald Trump was running such a fascinating campaign. Did you ever see anything like it in your life? There's actual research that shows that whenever they stopped covering Trump, people changed the dial. Fox acknowledged that, and so did CBS. Donald Trump's campaign was like you know, when you see an accident on the other side of the highway, we all rubberneck. There isn't anybody who doesn't rubberneck. Be honest about it. We all slow down and take a look. Well, Donald Trump was a car wreck over here with a marching band, dancing girls, and fireworks. And so the basics, the most important job, scrubbing the candidate, never got done. The Washington Post did a little more. I told all sorts of journalists, I have thousands and thousands of pages of Trump documents. Tell me what you want, I'll get them for you. The New York Times called me one time to ask for a single obscure document I didn't happen to have. I know it exists because I've seen it in the past, but if I have it, I couldn't find it. I misfiled it. And that was it. My former desk mate at the New York Times called me for it. Nobody else. Nobody called me up and said, hey, you want to tell us? And I said on TV, I'm available. Washington Post called, foreign newspapers called. 12 foreign television news crews have come to my home in Rochester, New York to film me about Donald Trump. ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS? Not. So who else? In green here, and then brown over here, and then we'll try somebody on this side of the room because I don't want to think I haven't thought about it.
Is there a good ongoing source, not the books, but ongoing news that will give us the information that the regular newspapers are not covering? I read The Nation, I read Mother Jones,
Right.
but not getting that.
It's a competitive market, and you got to read a lot of things. I mean, one of the things I hope you do is DC Report is free. We don't run ads. We never share a mailing list. We don't have any money, so we do 2-3 pieces a week. But we've repeatedly told things you don't know about. I mean, I'll give you an example. Every year, 100 American workers die from beryllium-related disease. The Obama administration had a rule to reduce that significantly. We don't know exactly how many, not to zero, but to significantly reduce it. Trump has delayed it now for a year. In other words, the Trump administration has killed 100 American workers. We're the only people who have reported it at DC Report. We were about the first to report about the bad ears thing, where they took those monuments in Utah and Arizona, shrunk them down dramatically to allow more mining. We're way ahead of everybody else about that stuff because we pay attention to the government. So we send you news alerts. Sign up for it. It's free. DCReport.org, singular. .org. DCReport.org, and it's singular, not plural. If you're a television watcher, the MSNBC shows in the evening do a very good job of getting into these issues. Lawrence O'Donnell, I think in particular. He and I think a lot alike, so I'm probably somewhat biased because he and I on occasion have come to the exact same point where I'm writing a column to run the next day and he says something and I'm like, no! Mother Jones has done very good work. And The Guardian has done surprisingly good work. So, but you got to look in more than one place. You can also set up alerts for things on search engines. So let me see, there was one other person over here, you, and then we're going to go to the other side of the room. And we're going to get a young person up there.
Okay. You say this is a very important election this fall. And with that, I trust, we do get to impeach Donald Trump and prosecute him and put him in jail. But that leaves behind Mike Pence.
Yep. Well, there are two things that will happen about this. If Donald Trump is impeached, we're going to have a constitutional crisis if they impeach Donald Trump because of the Russians. Because if Donald Trump's the beneficiary of the Russians and Mike Pence was, a sightless sheriff during the transition, can you allow the Russians to put their second favored person in? Well, if you say no, they both have to go, the problem is now you got Speaker Nancy Pelosi becoming President Pelosi because the Democrats would have to be in charge. And, can you hear people saying coup d'etat? I mean, so my guess is Pence would therefore become president, okay? And we're going to put up with him for a couple of years. The system is not, we don't have parliamentary elections. We can't have a confidence vote and have a new election. Got to live with that. Donald might get reelected in 2020 if the economy's booming. Mike Pence, I don't believe that that's possible. I just walked into a hotel restaurant in Washington, D.C. to get dinner one night, and it was full of conservative Republicans from Indiana who were there for a big political meeting. And I was shocked when they all wanted him out of there and said there's no chance he could be reelected. And then I started reading up on it, and that was in fact the case. So, but on the other hand, you know, Pence has apparently told people around him that God put him in this position to save the republic, and of course, you know, to control women's bodies. So over here, and then we're going to go up there. There's somebody over.
If we observed Connor Lamb's run in
Right.
Pennsylvania, he was successful. He didn't, address Donald Trump, and I resonate with him in that he addressed, basic people's needs and lives, and Social Security and jobs, and he was successful. We really need to concentrate.
So what's the question?
My question is, if we've read the Steele document,
Okay.
the dossier, and that Trump's morality has bottomed out, but doesn't seem to matter.
So why
Why
doesn't
not?
it matter? Why doesn't it? Listen, I was absolutely flabbergasted to interview a number of women just before the election, women in Rochester, New York, which I would describe as, it's a very wealthy city from the past, and has a lot of what used to be called liberal Republicans. And I was absolutely floored by the fact that a number of women said to me about the Billy Bush tape, "Oh, well, all men are like that. He's just worse." And my first reaction was, no, all men aren't like that. But it was a way of rationalizing, this behavior. And I don't think people are going to, we know the Democrats don't like Trump. That's no reason to vote for him. They got to have a program. I can tell you what the Republicans' economic platform is. I've written about this for decades. It's eminently clear. The reason we don't have more jobs and a more robust economy is the rich don't have nearly enough. If they don't get more, they won't invest. They won't create jobs. So we have to get more money for the rich. And the way we get that for them is through changing and reducing regulations and by tax cuts that go to the rich. And how do we pay for that? Well, we don't own up to it, but we go after programs that benefit children, the disabled, the elderly, workers, and veterans, because they aren't going to fight back. And we need somebody whose program is, no, we're going to focus the economics of this country on ordinary people. We want to have a much healthier society for the masses of Americans. So, way up here in the high school group, somebody had their hand up. There we go. A lot of the programs I give, I don't remember if it was on this flyer. I now ask people to put on, please come and bring a young person. Okay, yes.
So I haven't read your book, but I wanted
you
to
will.
know. Yes, I will.
Okay.
I wanted to know your exact relation with Donald Trump because you're speaking against him, but you know him. So
Well,
I was just, confused
sure.
on that.
I met Donald Trump the first week of June 1988 when I arrived in Atlantic City. We spoke very briefly that day, but I watched him and I had an immediate reaction. I remember calling my wife, who was still in Los Angeles, and saying, "I just met P.T. Barnum." And now the difference between Donald Trump and P.T. Barnum is, except for little children, everybody knew that these were hoaxes. The Fiji mermaid and the amazing two-headed woman. And he didn't hurt anybody. Donald was the most important person in Atlantic City. And I was there to test two things. Had the state of New Jersey actually cleaned up this vice-ridden business, as they claimed? And I wrote a book called Temples of Chance, in which I showed that, no, they didn't. It's a fraud. And they did it by, if you were a cocktail waitress or a blackjack dealer and there was some infraction, the state of New Jersey, it came down on you like a ton of bricks and got all sorts of news coverage about how corrupt you were. But when casino owners were laundering money for a guy in the Medellin drug cartel and Donald was hanging out with his biggest customer, a mobbed-up guy from up here in North Jersey, Bob Labuddy, who I also spent a lot of time with, what? No, we don't see anything. Or in one case, the head of the Division of Gaming Enforcement went on television and said, well, I had presented an intriguing case about one of the big gamblers, but some of the documents were missing. And the next scene under the Kent Monahan, is she still around? Kent Monahan on New Jersey Network? She's long gone. Okay, well, the next scene was me saying, well, it's interesting, there's a document missing. I don't have subpoena power, and I have 44 bankers' boxes of documents on this. What's missing? Anyway, Donald, very quickly I learned that his competitors told me he didn't know anything about the casino business. And I remember sitting there looking at this billionaire who owned another one of the casinos and saying, the guy owns 2 casinos. How can you tell me he doesn't know anything about the gambling business? I went to the state regulators who had a polite phrase. Donald is not what we call an operator. And then I talked to his own guys who were all like, are you kidding? He's ruining the business. He doesn't know what he's doing. And I began documenting this. And Donald very quickly learned that I and a reporter named Wayne Barrett and a Wall Street Journal reporter whom he tricked into doing something and ruined his career. The guy went on to become a rich hedge fund guy. That Donald was used to reporters who didn't care about the facts. You know, you got the famous headline on the cover of the New York Post, best sex ever. And years later, Marla Maples appeared playing herself on Designing Women, and at the end of the show looked into the camera and said, I never said that. He would just make things up. In the previous book, I tell about his imaginary lovers, his imaginary executives. I mean, just crazy stuff. So our relationship, it's been strained. The last time we spoke was mid-April 2 years ago, when he called me up at home and told me, quote, if I don't like the way you write it, I'm going to sue you. And I said, Donald, you're a public figure. That means that he would have to prove that I knowingly lied, which nobody's ever going to show because I don't lie. And Donald said, I don't care, I'll sue you anyway, which is designed to intimidate me. And I was frankly a little surprised by that because Donald knows that I personally hunted down a very vicious black on white racially motivated killer and confronted him and got an innocent man freed from life in prison. I've run into a burning building. I've run towards 2 of them. I've been roughed up by cops and Teamsters and longshoremen and done lots of crazy, stupid things like that. And he knows these stories because we've talked about them. And I thought, oh my God, he's out of control. But if he's doing that to me, imagine what he's doing to intimidate other people. And he was. He was going around saying, you know, you report this or that, I'll sue you. And that's one of the reasons I think they didn't. So somebody was way back. Oh, was there another young person in the far last row? Not sure that's one of the students, but go ahead. We'll do about 3 more. Okay.
I think you've conveyed a very lucid story about the problems we're facing. The question I have is, because I talk to people about this stuff all the time.
The question is?
Logic doesn't work. So how do you get through to people that are just beyond reason?
The way you get through to people is you do what Donald did. You reduce to marketing what people care about. What do people care about first and foremost? They want a roof over their heads. They want a car that starts in the morning. They want a job that pays them a reasonable wage for the work that they do. That's what they want. Most people. Some people, it's terribly important that they become 3 comma people. That's, you know, billionaire, 3 commas. I mean, it's really important to them. Okay, that's fine. Do what you want to do. But most people, you know what Gandhi said about India. The politics of India are bread and salt and water. And the politics of America are a decent, reliable job, a house you own, and a car that starts every day. And, you know, what did Huey Long say? A chicken in every pot. And that's what Donald promised, even though he had no intention of delivering and has been doing the opposite. And that's what people have to articulate. And I believe, and I recognize people can disagree with this, but I believe very firmly that a key element in that is that we have to have unions. All our economic competitors have unions. All of them. You know, Japan, unions are required under the Constitution that was written by the staff of General Douglas MacArthur, who was not exactly a lefty. And why did he do that? Because MacArthur believed that if you had unions, it would encourage democracy and social stability, and it would make people feel that they were participants in the government around them, not drones to do whatever the living God of the chrysanthemum throne told them to go do. So, you know, but somebody's got to articulate an economic message to people that they get. It was ma'am in the white. Is it possible to get rid of Citizens United?
In a state-by-state
Yeah.
vote.
Not with this Supreme Court. Citizens United represents a really serious problem, and let me explain that problem. It goes back to what I taught the law of the ancient world. We want to have artificial entities, corporations, trusts, partnerships. They encourage investment and risk-taking. If you started a business in ancient Samaria 4,000 years ago and borrowed money from the bank, which was the state, which was the church, and you couldn't pay it back, or you borrowed money from another person, depending on the specific loan and the terms of it, you, your children, your concubines, because most wealthy men had multiple wives, could all be sold into slavery. Not the kind of slavery in the South, labor slavery, but only for 3 years, which I call a proto-bankruptcy law. It limited how much somebody would loan you. You're going to be worth the work that you, your spouse, your children can do minus the cost of supporting you for 3 years. I'm not going to loan you any more money than that. And as this law developed, as the Romans created these opportunities, I, Emperor David, send you to suppress the Germanics, and after you have killed all those people in the north, you come back. Somebody has to take care of your property while you're gone. So we created proto-corporations and trusts and things to take care of your property for the 20 years that you're gone. If you travel in Europe, you'll notice the sign outside Stockholm when you arrive says Commune di Stockholm, or maybe that's Rome where it says Commune de Rome. These were municipal corporations. Well, the founders of this country said nothing about corporations in the Constitution. You know how many corporations were created in British colonial America? Not in London, but in British colonial America? 7. 6 of them were what we would call today either charities or public works, and one of them survives, the Boston Water Works. They were a way to pool capital and accomplish things. The one other one, the 7th one, created by the Connecticut, not Connecticut, but the New Haven colony before Connecticut, was the only one created for the specific purpose of making money, and it became a huge scandal. They had to shut it down in a year. It took 10 years to clean it up. The U.S. Supreme Court in the 1880s in the first case involving the 14th Amendment, which was to say slaves, former slaves, have the same rights as everybody else, without hearing, had the court clerk announce that, of course, corporations are persons under the 14th Amendment for property purposes. A case called Santa Clara Railroad, you can go read up about. Then we got these decisions, Buckley, Vallejo, and Citizens United, that said corporations have political rights, which is an abomination. They shouldn't have any political rights. And then we got something even worse than Citizens United. We got the Hobby Lobby decision. And I invite you to go on the internet, put in my byline, Hobby Lobby, and Newsweek.com and read my piece, 2 pieces about it, before and after the decision. Before the decision, I was wildly attacked by people on the right. After the decision, they all agreed with what I had written, but didn't give me any credit for it. And we literally have a Supreme Court now that has given religious rights to corporations. Literally, it's who are the parties, and then the question is presented. Every Supreme Court petition has a question. Do the parties have religious rights? You know? Dear Mammon, we pray to you for profits, with an F. And this Supreme Court is they're totally hostile to the idea that corporations need to be limited and controlled for public benefit. We got to get a new Supreme Court. That's another fight for another day. It's going to be with us for a long time. A long time. But we don't want to not have corporations. I want to be real clear. They're really important to creating wealth and being efficient. We just need to recognize they're supposed to be our servants, not our masters. So you, sir, and then you, and I think that's it. Sorry. Okay, sir.
Our tax system is very unfair to the middle class. Could you give us a preview of some of your ideas for making it less unfair?
I mean, the basic thing about what's wrong with our tax system is that very wealthy people who have a lot of capital get to enjoy their income now and pay their taxes in the future. If tomorrow you found out that, you know, Uncle Jose you'd never heard of left you $1 billion, and you go over to see one of the top-rate estate tax lawyers here, and I know most of them, or many of them, they will say to you, well, you now can live tax-free for the rest of your life. Because here's what we're going to do. We're going to buy you a portfolio of securities that does not pay dividends, and you're going to borrow against it. So you want to spend $10 million on your lifestyle. By the way, it's pretty hard to spend $10 million a year on consumption, but let's just assume that's the case. So you borrow $10 million from yourself. You have to pay interest at the current government rate, which is, I think, 0.9%, less than inflation, until the end of the year. And then you don't pay any taxes, because that's not income. Next year, your wealth has grown by 5% to $1.05 billion, and you borrow the $10 million plus the $90,000 interest and another $10 million from yourself. And you get richer and richer and richer and pay no taxes. If you're these big corporations, when I first reported years ago that they were paying their taxes in the future and getting interest-free loans, all sorts of people called the New York Times and wrote letters. I was crazy. That's ridiculous. Nobody profits off the income tax. Well, guess what? Congress ordered a study, 1,800 pages, that sits right in the middle of my bookshelf in my office, that said I was right, and indeed that Enron stamped its tax documents profit center because they make money off it. And we're going to get rid of that. Everybody's going to be taxed on every dollar they get. And I've devised a system in which there'll always be cheating, but you can't cheat without committing a crime with a second person. And that second person is liable for your taxes, and you're liable for them. If you correct right away when you're caught, it's a 5% penalty. If you don't correct it right away, it's a 200% penalty, which means the government stands to collect 6 times the amount of tax that's owed. And the other person goes to jail, the person you had to conspire with. And it's not a crime where we have to prove intent. All we have to prove is you did it, you go to jail. So it's, I hope to have this out in February of next year. So there was one other I was going to take. Is it you? Ah, okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Now that the special prosecutor has subpoenaed the Trump Organization's papers, do you feel that he is closer to getting, to wrapping up a case of collusion?
Well, collusion is not a crime. There's no crime called collusion. Conspiracy is a crime. It is not at all surprising that they've issued subpoenas for documents. I mean, this is how these things go. And leaks from this case and all others, they never come from the prosecution, because judges will just kill your whole case. They always come from defense lawyers. It may not be the immediate defense lawyer, but say you're a defendant in the case and your lawyer is some minor person we've never heard of, but he is now in the know about what's going on. He comes to somebody like me and wants to be a big shot and hopefully up his standing in the future. But the leaks all come from those folks. We know that Mueller has put together a stellar team. Mueller is an expert both, and he was a valorous officer in Vietnam, by the way, that Mueller is both an expert on counterintelligence and on white-collar financial crimes. And that's what this is all about. The 17 lawyers that he got to give up their $1 million plus incomes, and see how much really top white-collar defense lawyers make. The year before he became FBI director, Christopher Wray, who was a government prosecutor for a while, but most of his career was defending banks who were ripping off their customers, like Wells Fargo. I don't know, they were literally a customer, but banks of that scale. He made an income of, I think it was $9.6 million. It's really big money in this. They didn't give that up for $180,000 or $90,000 a year federal paycheck, except that they knew this is the most important thing they would do in their lives. And they're not living on that paycheck, of course. They're all better off than that. But if those 17 lawyers plus Mueller were to go and create, after this is all over, a new white-collar firm, Mueller and Partners, they would just blow away every other white-collar defense firm in America. These are literally the best people at this in the country. And whatever is there, and I have a lot of good ideas about what it is I'm not going to go into, but whatever is there, they're going to get. And let's remember that it was the British, Dutch, Australian, and my guess, but we don't know this for sure, there's some hints of it, Israeli governments that came to us and said to our intelligence community, hey, there's something really weird going on here with this guy running for president. we're learning bit by bit about, there were a lot more contacts than we knew about, a lot more information going on back and forth. We know that Donald has been doing squirrely deals with Russians to 1983. And there's a reason Donald said, looking into my finances, he told the New York Times, that would be crossing a line and suggesting he'd fire Mueller. Well, it's always about the money. There's 3 ways to corrupt people: their wallet, their zipper between their ears. Before I covered Donald, I covered the LAPD, and we had a police chief, Daryl Gates, who had a worldwide spying operation. They had undercover officers in Moscow and Havana, the LAPD. They burglarized people. They tailed me. My first date with my wife, the police chief gave me an incredibly detailed description of our dinner and a recommendation on the reasons, rather carnal, as to why I should have spent $2 more on a better champagne. But he was corrupt here. Okay, he never took a dime, and the matters involving Zipper were minor and not important to his job. Donald's corrupt all 3 ways. He's subject to leverage, he's subject to blackmail. If Donald weren't president, he'd never get a security clearance. Not a snowball's chance in hell he'd get a security clearance. And, Stormy Daniels and the Playboy Playmate, they're just 2 names that have come out. And if journalists knew about them, and they did, imagine what the Russians, with all their training and whatnot, knew. And as this case goes forward, always remember this. One of the Trump sons proposed to Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the U.S., that he be allowed to go to the Russian embassy in Washington and use its secret communications through their skiff to communicate with the Kremlin. Now, why that wasn't immediately seized on by Congress as an evidence of disloyalty is beyond me. But why do we know that? Even if we have cracked the Russians' communications, we wouldn't tell you that. There's a very good episode of West Wing where Anna Deavere Smith, as the National Security Advisor, explains that they're not going to tell about stuff from the 40s because it could reveal something in sources and methods. Well, we know that because the Russians wanted us to know it. Why would the Russians want us to know that Donald Trump's son wanted to use Russian secret communications to deal with the back channel to the Kremlin? Well, I think the simplest, most logical explanation is they were sending a message to Donald. We know a lot about you, pal. You get out of line, we can reveal lots of stuff about you, pal. That's what they were doing. Now, that may not be the explanation, but it is certainly a logical and Occam's razor explanation for what they did. So Mueller is going to do the best job that can be done. He faces one huge obstacle. There is a regulation in the Justice Department that you may not indict a sitting president. The Watergate prosecutors did not indict Richard Nixon. He was an unindicted co-conspirator. His tax guy went to jail. There's no doubt Richard Nixon was a criminal. He was a felon. Spiro Agnew did go to prison. He was a felon. So we had a president and somebody a heartbeat away who were both criminals. But we never indicted Nixon on the idea that this is out of respect for the office. If Mueller indicts, Mueller doesn't indict a grand jury. If Mueller gets a grand jury to indict, there'll be immediately a big fight over, can you do that because of the regulations? So I doubt that's going to be the approach you're going to see, but you're going to see things happen. And there's nothing that prevents him from indicting all the people around Trump and saying you're an unindicted co-conspirator. And those people who think, well, Donald Trump will pardon everybody, 2 things happen. One, once you're pardoned, you lose your right to refuse to testify for self-incrimination because there's nothing that can happen to you and in the federal system. And secondly, Mueller set a signal, just like the Russians did early on, when Eric Schneiderman went public and said, we are cooperating and sharing information with the special prosecutor because almost everything in question happened in his jurisdiction across the river in New York. Presidential pardons don't apply to state law. So while I say there's no good ending for the country for this with Donald, there's no good ending for Donald either if Mueller does his job. Thank you all for coming. I'll be here for a few more minutes, and don't lose hope. Be citizens. Do the work.